All right, so as I mentioned earlier, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 19 today, as we continue in our study of the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. I kind of have troubles with saying 1st and 2nd Samuel because in the Jewish scriptures, it's just the book of Samuel. It's one book, but for some reason, as Protestants, we divided it into two separate books. So in a lot of references that you'll read about for Samuel, it appears as one book, and you kind of have to know that it's the same book, even though, or first or second, depending on what chapters you're in. So we're in 2 Samuel today, and it's been a while since our last meeting. And so to get us caught up, if you'll remember, David's son Absalom caused a rebellion that resulted in a civil war. And the civil war was put down, and in the process, Absalom was killed. And David, when he heard the news of Absalom's death, went into mourning. And he was very upset, very mournful, was loudly mourning for his son Absalom. We'll talk more about that as we get into the study. But let's go ahead and do our customary read-through of the chapter, and then we'll come back and begin to unpack. So turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 19. Verse 1. Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom, and the whole army, and for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, 'The king is grieving for his son.' The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, 'O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son.' Then Joab went into the house to the king and said, 'Today you have humiliated all your men. You have just, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now, go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you do not go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth till now.' So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. Throughout the tribes of Israel, all the people were arguing among themselves, saying, 'The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country to escape from Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?' The King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. 'Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood, so why should you be the last to bring the king back? And say to Amasa, are you not my flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army for life in place of Joab.' He won over the hearts of the men of Judah so that they were all of one mind. They sent word to the king, 'Return you and all your men.' Then the king returned and went as far as the Jordan. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on that day, my lord, the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind, for I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king." Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed." David replied, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" Sorry, I'm having challenges pronouncing biblical names this morning. "What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Do I not know that today I am king over Israel?" So the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king promised him on an oath. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he safely returned. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He said, "My lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame," I said, "I will have my donkey saddled and I will ride on it so that I could go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserved nothing but death from my lord the king, but you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king?" The king said to him, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land." Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely." Barzillai, the Gileadite, also came down from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Now, Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He had provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you." Barzillai answered the king, "How many more years will I live that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should your servants be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross the Jordan with the king for a short distance, but why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town near the tomb of my father and mother. But here is your servant King Kimham. Let him cross over with the lord the king. Do for him whatever you wish." The king said to Kimham, "Kingham shall cross over with me, and I will do for him whatever you wish, and anything you desire from me I will do for you." So all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and bid him farewell, and Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. So all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan together with all his men?" And the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have you or have we eaten
Thank
any
you.
of the king's provisions? Have we anything of ourselves? The men of Israel answered the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king, so we have a greater claim on David than you have. Why then do you treat us with contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing back our king? But the men of Judah pressed their claim even more forcefully than the men of Israel. And that is 2 Samuel chapter 19. Somebody needs to mute their microphone, please. All right. And so the overall picture is that David, so now that the rebellion with against Absalom has been thwarted, has been put down, it's now time for David to return home. And I think it's interesting that David he isn't like triumphantly marching back into the city. He's actually asking if he can return. And the people are deciding that, well, now that Absalom's gone, I don't think there's any better choice than David. I mean, he knows what he's doing. He's been doing the job for a while now. I think we need to be loyal to David. Of course, some were always loyal to David. They never stopped being loyal to David. But others had been loyal to Absalom, and many of them were afraid that because of their loyalty to Absalom, that might get them killed. And instead, David says, "No, I'm not going to kill anybody. I'm going to return to Jerusalem, and we're going to continue like nothing ever happened." To a point, and the point is that Absalom was dead. I think it's very interesting that the way that this chapter opens, David is mourning. It says in verse 1, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom, and the whole army, and for the whole army, that the victory that day was turned into mourning. So David's mourning was so loud and so public that anybody who was loyal to David and or loved David was mourning along with him. So instead of celebrating the victory, the nation was in mourning. There's also kind of an interesting backdrop going on here, or maybe better put, not a conflict really, but a comparison. So if you'll recall, when David mourned for his son that Bathsheba had born unto him, he reacted completely different. So let's take a look at that. Let's go ahead and turn to 2 Samuel, and we're in chapter 12, starting at chapter 12, and starting at verse 15. So 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 15. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted, and he went into his house, and he spent the night lying on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's servants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, we spoke to David, but he would not listen to us. How can we tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his servants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied, he is dead. Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed and put on lotions and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. And then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. His servants asked him, why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat. He answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, and he will not return to me. So, what a contrast to what David is doing after the death of Absalom, where he is basically mourning and he can't do anything else. Everybody knows about his mourning, and they're mourning along with him. So, why the difference? And I think that there's a couple of things going on here. One is that David obviously loved Absalom, and even though Absalom caused him great pain, and if given the opportunity, Absalom would have killed David, and Absalom absolutely had, royal intentions or kingly intentions. He saw himself on the throne, and he was willing to forcefully remove his father. But David never stopped loving Absalom, and even in David's mind, Absalom was supposed to be the next king. He was the next likely of his family to be able to step into that role. Unfortunately, Absalom was unwilling to wait for David to pass and for Absalom to become rightly king. He was willing to take the throne by force. So I think that part of David's mourning is that, it was a real paradigm shift for him in his mind, because he too thought that Absalom would be the next king. But I think there's something else going on here. I think that what we see in the death of the child is that, once the child had passed, that David realized he knew exactly where the child was. The child was in heaven with our Heavenly Father. And I think that David may have been uncertain about Absalom's salvation. Where with the child, the very last verse of the passage that I read, he says, that the child, that I will go to be with the child, but the child will not return to me. And what he means by that is, when I die, I know that I'm going to see my child again. But because they have died, the child can't return to me. So I think that David was sure of the child's salvation, knew that the child was in heaven with our Heavenly Father. But with Absalom, that was not necessarily the case. And that David didn't know if Absalom was in heaven. And it mourned him, the thought that when David does pass and when he does go to be with the Father, that his son Absalom might not be there. So just kind of an interesting contrast between the way he was with the child and the way he was with Absalom. All right, so then Joab, who was, the chief of David's armies, the captain of David's armies, Joab then has had enough. Now, also an interesting sort of like backstory here is Joab's the one that killed Absalom, and it doesn't look like David knows that. David knows how, or that Absalom died, but he probably doesn't know all the details. Like it was Absalom that it was Joab that took a javelin and stabbed Absalom 3 times, and then it was Joab's men who finished him off and then buried him under a pile of stones. So David might not know all the details, but Joab has had enough of David's mourning and the impact it's having on everybody else. So back to verse 1, Joab was told, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom and the whole army, and for the whole army. The victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, the king is grieving for his son. Now, it also speaks to the loyalty of the troops, of David's men, that they were so loyal to him that when the king mourned, they mourned. What made the king sad made them sad. Verse 4, well, actually, verse 3. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. So instead of celebrating in the streets because of the mourning, everybody snuck away. But this also includes Israel. Now, the thing to keep in mind that helps the text make a little bit more sense is that David unified the nation, all 12 tribes, into a single nation, Israel. But as a national identity, there still was a viewpoint of the northern 10 tribes that they called Israel, and the southern 2 tribes they called Judah. So that's the comparison that we'll see later in this chapter between the men of Judah talking to the men of Israel. It is one nation, Israel, but when they talk about Israel in reference to the tribes, they're talking about the 10 northern tribes. Verse 3, the men stole in the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Verse 5, having enough, then Joab went into the house of the king and said, today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and concubines. It's like, David, I don't think that you appreciate what has just happened here. I mean, you're so tied up in mourning for the loss of Absalom, that you completely miss the fact that these people were willing to die for you. And how is it that you show your appreciation? Well, you haven't. You haven't shown any appreciation. I don't think that you understand. You're so into your own personal pain that you don't understand the sacrifice that others made for you so that you're still here and breathing. Then in verse 6, Absalom says, you love those who hate you. Who hated him? Absalom. And hate those who love you. So the people that fought for David, he's ignoring. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and if all of us were dead. So if the situation was reversed and Absalom was still alive, yet all of the people that were loyal to David were killed, Joab is asserting that David would be pleased with that. I don't think that that's actually the case. He's using hyperbole or he's using exaggeration to make his point. And his point is, David, get off your duff, dust yourself up, clean yourself up, and go and thank the people. David has this problem. He is right now living in Mahanaim. Mahanaim is on the other side of the Jordan from Israel. Okay, so it's actually in the country of what we call Jordan today, but it's on the other side of the Jordan River. And in this chapter, it talks about the Jordan, right? The assumption that they're making is that you understand that they're referring to the Jordan River, and that it is a border or a demarcation line between the nation of Israel. It's the borderlands, and David is just on the other side of it in Mahanaim. Kind of an interesting aside. I spent a little time looking into Mahanaim. Because why did David run there? I mean, besides the fact that it's just over the border of Israel, right? So he was just outside of the reach of Absalom's armies. What's the background of Mahanaim? Well, it actually goes back to the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 32, it's the location where Jacob had his vision of the angels, and what he saw and the angels coming down from heaven. He called them the angels the Lord's hosts, and in Hebrew, the name Mahanaim means 2 camps, and the name was given it because what Jacob saw in his vision was his camp and all his people, and then God's people. So in the single place, the one place, there were 2 camps, Jacob's camp and God's camp. And so he gave it the name 2 camps, or in Hebrew, Mahanaim. So the Hebrew history for that town goes back a long ways. And before David returns, we'll see here in the chapter, well, we actually saw last week, remember, David wanted to go out to battle with his troops from Mahanaim, And his general said, no, you got to stay here. Let us do our job. We don't want to put you at risk. You stay here. David stood at the city gates and he waved to all of the troops as they passed by. That was all done at the city gates for the city or the town of Mahanaim. And so, like I said, there was a lot of Hebrew history in this town. It was a logical place for David to run, and it wasn't all that far from the area where David lived for I'm trying to remember, 7 years, when he was running from Saul and staying in Philistine territory. So Mahanaim was not far from Philistine territory. All right, so having said that, let's go ahead and continue. Verse 7, now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you do not go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. They'll all leave you, David. This is critical. You need to do this now. You need to get off your duff now, get yourself cleaned up, and go out and encourage the people. Oh, otherwise, no one will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth until now. No matter what you've experienced in your past, if you don't do this thing, David, if you don't get up and go and encourage the people, it will be far worse for you than it has been in the past, is what he's saying. So Joab is forcefully trying to make his point to David that it's time to get up, it's time to move on, it's time to be a king and be there for the people. Verse 9, throughout the tribes of Israel, all the people were arguing among themselves, saying, the king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country to escape from Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? So the writer is telling us, the author here is telling us that amongst the 10 tribes of Israel, that's what we're talking about, the 10 northern tribes, there's disagreement and there's argument. And largely, the people of the 10 tribes, or the northern tribes, or Israel, were loyal to Absalom. Now Absalom is dead. He was unsuccessful in his attempt to raise a coup, a rebellion, and to take over the throne by force. So now what are we doing? Who's going to lead us? Why haven't you asked to bring David back? And so this discussion, this argument is going on amongst the 10 tribes. David, verse 11, King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. And you'll recall that at this time there were 2 high priests. They were in this high priest position, and it was Zadok and Abiathar. So David sent them a message, and it read, ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? So David had gotten the intel. He knew that this disagreement was going on amongst the 10 northern tribes. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to get the support of Zadok and Abiathar to call David home. They're the high priests. The nation looks up to the high priests. So if they would say it's time to bring David back, then the rest of the nation would follow. So David is saying, why don't we do this? Now, you'll recall that David actually used Zadok and Abiathar as spies during the rebellion. So they were loyal to David. They remained loyal to David. But for some reason at this particular moment, they had been quiet about throwing in their support of bringing David back to Jerusalem. 13. And to say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army for life in place of Joab. Now, I don't quite understand this passage, because David is promising the position of being the captain of David's armies to Amasa, where Joab has been loyal all along. And it may be possible that maybe David did get the rest of the story about how his son Absalom died, and he's having second thoughts about Joab remaining the captain of his army. And he's basically planting the seed here in this message with Amasa that maybe it's time to have a change in who's the captain of the armies, of David's armies. Verse 14, he won over the hearts of the men of Judah so that they were all one mind. Okay, so now this is Judah. So this is the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which oftentimes are just use the shortcut or shorthand of Judah. He won over the hearts of the men of Judah so that they were all of one mind. They said, return, you and all your men. Then the king returned and went as far as the Jordan. So once he had heard from the elders of the tribes of Judah, then he felt that he was in a position to be able to return. He packs up all of his stuff, packs up all of his household, and he begins the trek home, and he goes as far as the Jordan River. Again, it's this demarcation line. So he hasn't re-entered the nation of Israel or the country of Israel. He marches right up to the border and he stops. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. So this was going to become a ceremony. This was going to become a procession. And it was also going to become a homecoming celebration for David. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet the king David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. So there's some interesting details in here, and we've got some additional characters showing up in this story that we've been introduced previously. You'll remember that Shimei is the person who cursed David as he left Israel. So when he previously left Israel and crossed the Jordan to the other side, Shimei was the one that was cursing David and throwing stones at David and his people. And now Shimei wants to be the first person to greet David and welcome him back. That's a little bit of a contrast too. Why is this going on? What's going on here? Well, it may be the case that Shimei realized that he acted hastily in the presence of the king, and that the king has the power to lop off his head if he should choose, and he wants to continue living. So he's decided to celebrate the winner in the rebellion, in the Civil War, and to greet David back. And he wanted to be one of the first ones to be there, to see David, to welcome David in across the Jordan. And so is Ziba. Ziba is there as well. So you'll recall that Ziba is the steward of Saul's servants. Saul's long gone, and the only family member of Saul's that's left is Mephibosheth, right? And David had charged Ziba to take care of Mephibosheth, to farm his land, to cultivate his land, to provide an income for Mephibosheth. And so Ziba also wants to be one of the first people to welcome David back. And I think there's a little bit of an undercurrent going on there as well that we'll touch here in just a little bit. Verse 18, they crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he, King David, wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king. So the tribes of Joseph that he's referring to here is another name associated, or another reference associated with the tribes of Israel, or the 10 northern tribes. And so Shimei wanted to be the first of the northern tribes to greet David. And you'll recall that Shimei, part of his grievance with David was that he was part of Saul's family. He was a distant relative, wasn't a son or a grandson or anything like that, but he was a distant relative, a cousin. And he knew all the wrong that David had done. He knew where all the skeletons were in the closet, according to him. And while David was in a position of weakness and leaving Israel, Shimei was the one that was kicking stones, throwing stones, cursing, and now he is welcoming David back and asking him to please forgive him for the sins that he had committed when he treated David so badly. Tom, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. He says here that he is from the tribe of Joseph, but back on 16 and 17, they're talking about both of them being from the tribe of Benjamin.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe I have that backwards. Maybe tribes of Joseph refers to Judah, but at any rate, it's a catch-all for a group of the tribes. Thank you for pointing that out. Verse 21, then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. David replied, what does this have to do with you? So, Abishai, what business is this of yours? You sons of Zeruiah, what right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel? So the king said to Shimei, you shall not die, and the king promised him on an oath. Now we move on to Mephibosheth. And I think this is interesting because if you look at this like a movie, right? David's procession, David's people, David's household, they're all making their way. They're all marching towards the Jordan. And then on the other side of the Jordan, they're greeted by all of these people. And the same people that saw them out are wanting to see them back in. And each one is wanting to have their moment with David to explain their case, to defend themselves, because they know that being the successful force, the successful king in the rebellion and resulting civil war, that David had the power and the authority to have them all killed. Again, verse 24, Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. Also recall that he is lame in both feet. It's not an easy thing for him to do. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day that he returned. Now, this is a little different than we were told previously in chapter 18. What Ziba had told David was that Mephibosheth saw the rebellion as a potential opportunity for Saul's household to take back the throne. Of course, that's not what was happening at all. Absalom didn't have Saul's household in mind. He didn't have his lineage or Saul's throne in mind at all. He was thinking of the throne for himself. Well, it may be that Ziba had provided David with incorrect information, and it's sort of mentioned here. So verse 25. Well, let me go back to 24. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet, trimmed his mustache, or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. So Mephibosheth was loyal to David and appreciative of what David did by allowing Mephibosheth to dine at the king's table and treating Mephibosheth as family. So Mephibosheth didn't forget what David had done for him. Verse 25. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He said, "My lord the king, since I your servant am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it so that I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from the lord the king." You know, the successful king had the right to kill off all of the previous king's family. "But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your tables. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king? I don't have a leg to stand on," which is kind of, I don't know, it was lame. I'm sorry, that's terrible. Um, I I don't have a leg to stand on. So he has no right to make any claims of David. Anything that David does for Mephibosheth, he says, is great because he doesn't deserve anything. He doesn't deserve any special treatment from the king. Uh, verse 29, the king said to him, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land." So instead of getting rid of Ziba, he's going to separate the two, right? He's going to say, "Ziba, you take this portion of Saul's land. Mephibosheth, you still own this portion of Saul's lands." Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely." So this really speaks to Mephibosheth's sincerity. He says, "You know what? I really don't care about it, David. What I care about is that you are back and that you're still alive and you are safe. You can give it all to Ziba. I don't care." Verse 31, Barzillai, the Gileadite, also came down from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Now, Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you." So while David was on the run, it was Barzillai that provided David with provisions that actually fed David and his household. And he was actually a foreigner, but he was not an Israelite, and but he was loyal to David. And David wants to thank him for his loyalty and for his support by having him come and live with him in the palace in Jerusalem. But Barzillai says, "I'm an old man. I don't have many days left. It doesn't make sense for me to travel with you to Jerusalem. I'm at the point in my life where I can no longer taste food. I can no longer hear people sing. It's better for me to stay. But tell you what, why don't you take Kimham and you can do for him whatever you would have done for me?" In essence, what he says is saying here. "I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance, but why should the king reward me in this way?" Again, that talks to his loyalty and his sincerity. What he didn't do it looking for a reward. "Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town near the tomb of my mother and father, or father and mother. And here is your servant Kimham." Now, I don't know a lot about Kimham, but evidently he was a person that was dear to Barzillai. Let him cross over with the Lord the king. Do for him whatever you wish. The king said, Kimham shall cross over with me, and I shall do for him whatever you wish. And anything you desire from me, I will do for you. So again, David is showing his appreciation for what Barzillai did during the rebellion. Verse 39, so all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and bid him farewell, and Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. Now, that's a key. Half the troops of Israel. So half of the troops of the 10 tribes. Only half. So there's another half out there. Verse 41, soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying, why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan together with all his men? They're complaining that Judah, the tribes of Judah, were trying to take all the glory, that they were there to meet the king. Why is it just them? Why are the tribes of Judah trying to take all the glory in this moment? So there is grumbling. That's the point. There is grumbling amongst the tribes of Israel. Verse 42. All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, we did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves? Look, guys, we didn't benefit here. We didn't eat any of the king's food. We didn't do it. We are loyal to David. David is our own flesh and blood. He's from the tribe of Judah. So he's our own flesh and blood. Why wouldn't we be here? We're not trying to do anything underhanded. We're not trying to set ourselves up or feather our own beds. We're not trying to take all the glory. We're just glad that David's coming home. 43. Then the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king, so we have a greater claim on David than you have. Why then do you treat us with contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing back our king? So where before in the tribes of Israel there was grumblings about whether or not to bring David home or not, to whether there was a better choice for a king, there wasn't. And so now the tribes of Israel are now saying, wait a minute, weren't we the first ones who wanted him to come back? Do we not have 10 tribes and you only have 2? Don't we have more skin in this game than you do? Us being 10 tribes or 10 shares as opposed to your 2? But the point is, now the people are arguing about who was the first to ask David to come home. So David now has wide support amongst all the peoples to return home to Jerusalem and to take the throne on again and to become their king. But the men of Judah pressed their claim even more forcefully than the men of Israel. So even though they were just 2 of the 12 tribes, they didn't back down from the 10 tribes and making their case for their support of King David. But the overall point here is that David had wide support of the people to return. David did not, steal his throne back. He didn't creep back into his throne. David actually was wanted back. David came back, and it was a time of celebration for the people. And it all started with Joab telling David that enough was enough and that he needed to get off his duff and be a king again. And if Joab hadn't done that, things might have turned out very differently for David. But in God's plan, in God's sovereignty, David was still king. Even though David was still suffering the results of his sins and the curse that God put on him and said that he would experience nothing but pain from his household, from his family. God's hand never left David, and David was still God's anointed and the person who rightly was supposed to be on the throne. The other thing that kind of strikes me about this chapter is a question of how differently things would have turned out for Absalom and David if, when David asked Absalom to return home from exile, you remember Absalom left and he was there for 3 years, and David asked him to come home. What if David had greeted Absalom when he returned like the father of the prodigal son greeted his son when his son returned? How much different had things might have gone? Would there have been a revolt? Would there have been a civil war? Would David had to have run from Jerusalem? Would that situation have happened at all? We don't know, right? Because that's not the way that the future went. But it is an interesting question. Does the responsibility of all of this that happened lay on David's shoulders? And could it have been avoided if he would have greeted Absalom like the father of the prodigal son greeted his son? When the father of the prodigal son, when he saw the speck in the distance on the road, and his heart leapt, and then he told himself, no, be practical. That could be anyone. That's not your son. That's not my son. Be practical. It's been years. And then he gets closer and he says, oh, I think it's my son. And then he gets a little closer and he says, it is my son. And he runs out to greet him like nothing had ever happened. And he hugs him and kisses him. And he puts a robe on him and a ring on his finger. And he prepares for a celebration because his son has returned home. But David, the way he reacted was he ignored his son. And he said, even though he's home, I don't want to see his face. Probably a poor choice on David's part. Closing thoughts, comments?
If all that would have happened with Absalom being brought back into the family, then Solomon never would have been king.
Well, that's possible.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Good point, Jim. Thanks. What else?
Well, there's more to come because we have to deal with Job.
Yeah, with Joab. Yeah, right,
those.
Exactly. Yeah,
he provides for that. But anyway, we'll talk about that later.
David's troubles are not over.
No, they are not over.
They are not over.
Thanks,
all right,
Terry.
Gentlemen. Thank you all for being here today. Please have a good rest of your week and go with God.
You too, Terry. Thank you.
Thank you, Perry.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Barry.
Thanks, Barry. Bye-bye.